Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we search for the theories that are going to change the world. And along the way, sometimes we look at ways in which the theories that are going to change the world have a very difficult time finding their way to the conversation.
We've talked about quantum mechanics a lot on this podcast. We actually started this show and called it Demystifying Science originally, now DemystifySci, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to make the case that it is incredibly important for us to get mysticism out of the foundations of science, because so many things go wrong when you mix mysticism with your explanations for the natural world.
In fact, they're definitionally polar inversions. The scientist, in the ideal case, gives you a step-by-step story about how a phenomenon unfolds. The mystic just says it does unfold, and it does the way that I say, and you take that on faith. Those are the only two options. They're polar extremes. And in practice, there's probably a mixture of both of these in every different explanation. But we thought there's getting to be a bit too much hand-waving and a bit too much take my word for it at the heart of fundamental physics.
This is not an attempt to eradicate mysticism or mythology or supernatural thinking, even. I think that these things are really important and they're really vital for humans. There has never been a society without some kind of supernatural cosmology in the history of anthropological study of humans. Like, you literally cannot go to some tribe in the forest and discover that they're just ultra-rationalist beings that don't have any kind of spirit that imbues the world. It doesn't exist. So we seem to need it.
Like, you can't even go into a marriage and find one that operates on purely rational principles. Like, that doesn't make sense. Relationships are inherently have purpose and desires and wills and conflicting interests. And there's a whole level that plays out that isn't just material bodies pushing each other out of the way. That's insane to look at. The reality is just being physics.
Shiloh and I have always been really big believers in the fact that there's something very, very, very strange about quantum physics, which is that when you get down to the bottom of it and you really ask the question of, hey man, what's going on down there? People want to say magic. And I have a really strong feeling that that's not the best way to encounter the world. But today on the podcast, we have a professor of quantum physics at Southampton University, and we kind of give her the opportunity to convince us that perhaps this is a fair way of looking at the world.
I don't think we should say any more about what happens in this conversation. Somebody's complaining in the comments section recently that we give away too much of what happens in the conversation, so you guys are going to just have to stick around and see what happens. But I think that you understand the framework upon which this all plays out. We explore consciousness, we look at definitions for life, we look at some very interesting quantum examples, and we look to the past at something like the Ptolemaic system, where the math was extraordinarily rigorous, the data set was very, very well developed, the observational ability was great. Everything should have given these mathematical physicists the correct answer about the organization of the solar system, but they were completely wrong. So there's ample precedent for these kind of approaches leading us in the wrong direction, and we try this on with Ivette and so much more. You guys are going to love it.
If you enjoy this podcast and you would like to support us, there are a couple ways that you can do that. Number one is you can come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and you can sign up to give the podcast like 75 cents a week. 75 cents a week is a price point that we picked because we figured that it was something that was well within reach for most people, but through the law of large numbers still means that we get to meet our goals of being able to have yearly live events. We get to take Paradigm Drift on the road. We get to record these conversations in person, and we get to really make this into a community that is more than just us sitting in our living room staring at a teleprompter. And so if you join us there, you can help us. If you want to do something else, we have hoodies for sale down in the description. We have 2 designs on them right now. We are going to add a couple more in the coming weeks. We're also selling something that I'm particularly proud of, which is our very first album. We have a band called Secretary of Nature, and we recorded and mixed and tracked and everything else. I don't know the technical terms for any of these things. Shiloh is our true engineer here. But it's basically a rock and roll album of a bunch of poetry and harmonies and just explorations about what it means to be alive and how weird it is that everything is so good and so bad and so everything at once. And so you can pick that up on the shelf down below the description.
One last thing before we get to the conversation. If you have a theory that you would like to try on with the world and with our community, you might consider signing up for Paradigm Shift. We are taping the next one in a little bit over a week now. It's going to be on October 17th. And it is your chance to put your name in the hat. Maybe we will pull your name and you will present a theory in 60 seconds or less. And if you do, then we'll talk to you about it. And if you completely blow our mind, maybe you'll end up doing an entire 3-hour podcast at some point down the line. If you just want to hang out and watch this all unfold as we do the live taping, that would be super awesome too. We have a really lively chat going the entire time. And so I would love to see as many of you come out for the taping. It is next Friday, that is October 17th. At 7 p.m. Pacific.
And for now, enjoy the conversation with Ivette Fuentes, quantum physics professor at Southampton University. See you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
And so where do you fall in the question of teleportation? Are you pro or anti?
How close are we to being able to teleport ourselves?
Yeah. Well, it's like the other day, like everybody, I was in the middle of traffic and saying, come on, how are we? When are we going to get? Yeah. I think that we're more than just atoms. So I wouldn't volunteer, let's put it like that.
So you think that the future, if that technology were to exist, it would be sort of like an antenna that we beam between different groups of atoms, we somehow would like transmit ourselves to some other atoms or something like that?
I guess that's how people think about it, right? So you have because what we teleport is information.
Yeah.
So then, if you're going to teleport, let's say me or you or a person, you don't teleport the matter. So you would have to have like all the atoms and everything physical needed on the other end. And then all the information would teleport and so on. But I think it really boils down to your beliefs on, are we just a bunch of atoms put together? I think maybe most physicists think that we're just that.
Really?
I don't. I guess. Well, many. I would guess. I think. Yeah. I mean, the universe is just atoms and fields. So then, maybe very complicated and difficult to understand. But everything we are is in the information in the atoms. So you teleport and then you're there. But I guess the worry that some mothers have is that, will it still be me? No, I guess
that's
it's
strange
like
because you have
it's a fair
different set of
question.
atoms every decade, like all your atoms will be swapped out anyways. So it's surprising that like you say physicists would think we're just atoms, because clearly we're some pattern of atoms more than anything. I mean, of course we have this material substrate that we exist as part of, but I don't know, it's weird because when I look at like the history of physics, I feel like there's been a lot of, I wouldn't say religious, but like quasi-religious thinkers, right? I mean, famously,
well,
like from
that is
Einstein
something that
on down.
Yes, it's very interesting. But when we study physics at university, even when we take, if you take a course on philosophy of physics, which I did, you usually don't talk about much about how people like Planck or like Schrödinger or so on used to think about consciousness. And I mean, I was impressed once that I don't know why I became curious about that, and I just started to Google, and even in like Schrödinger's Wikipedia page, I think I found that he believed in things like Vedanta, I think it was, and like what do you call this? I forgot. Non-duality, and so many of the fathers, and I don't know if mothers, but of quantum physics were concerned with questions about not just physics, but what are we, and what's there in the universe is all that we see and think about with atoms, is that's it, or is there more to it? And I think they took these questions very seriously. Actually, you know what is really beautiful that I found out that actually I bought the book. Schrödinger wrote a book called "What Is Life," and then you know about this, right? Yes, and then I found out that was it Watson and Crick got inspired by his book, and well, part of the work they did ended up being influenced by Schrödinger.
What is
So
he? What is? Remind me. I studied this like 10 years ago. I remember getting into this. How does he define? Does he answer his question? What is life? Does he define it in some physical sense or in some succinct way?
I I didn't go that deep into it.
Do you remember?
He doesn't.
Okay,
He
okay.
has like a pretty mathematical, almost like free energy definition from what I remember. He's basically talking about the fact that you have these gradients and these flows, and life inserts itself into this gradient and then it does stuff. And I think that he spends a lot of the book trying to figure out how rare it is that life exists. But it is a really, really funny book because it's a quantum physicist who's suddenly
Yes.
occupied himself with this question of what is life. And so
Yeah.
comes at it from this same statistical probabilistic lens that he uses for physics. And it
Yes.
feels like such a foreign frame when you apply it to biology because it feels like something is missing.
Oh, yes.
And I've always wondered if there's the same sort of piece that's missing when it's applied to physics as well. Where if you look at if you simply look at everything through the lens of probability as opposed to asking about, what's underneath the probability,
Yeah.
does it lead you astray? Does it cause you to have strange confusions that are informed by your numinous relationship to the mathematics?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I shouldn't be talking too much about things I know nothing about, but I guess because, like, I wish I knew more about biology and what is life, but I guess it's similar to the question about what is consciousness. Is life just something that emerges from the interactions between atoms and fields, or is there something special about it? Like, is there a kind of spark that doesn't belong to the physical world, right? Or same as in, I have a tendency of thinking that consciousness and life go together somehow. But well, definitely, I don't know much about either.
Why do you think that there's a tension between those two poles? Like, why does it have to be one or the other? If like why can't it be this spark, this incredible, miraculous spark that plays out on a material tapestry, right? I just don't see there really being a conflict between there being this abstraction, which is life, which encompasses all of these, non-physical processes, essentially motivations and desires and will and all this bizarre stuff that you can't really just draw a nice equation for.
Yeah.
But it plays out on a material substrate, which doesn't seem to really be in conflict. I find it strange that people like fall on one side or the other as if they can't work together.
Yes, I think there is a historic reason for that. And again, I'm talking about things I know nothing about. In my country, we say like shoemaker to your shoes. But anyways, maybe what I can do is just tell you what I know, and if you know a little bit more, we fill in with it. But I remember hearing about that actually recently, because I'm interested in that same question that you asked me. I'm interested in that kind of thing. And I think maybe in a video or something like that, I heard that it had to do with some conflicts between the church and science. So something historically very important happened. I don't know. I mean, I was hearing about it, but I can't remember what it was. But it was something like Galileo or, one of these revolutions. And that caused like a lot of conflict. And then somehow there was a resolution by saying, okay, look, science takes care of, you know, the material world and, you know, the behavior of physical things and so on, and religion takes care of the spiritual. And there's like a divorce there, right? But if you think about it, many people working in science also have that divorce in their own lives, because, you know, some of us, I mean, I grew up in Mexico, and Mexico is very Catholic. So my grandmothers were Catholic, both of them. And you know, they used to talk about God like the most normal thing on earth. So I grew up hearing things like that, and it was very natural to me. I never, when they went into more details, I never really kind of agreed. Like what many of the things from Catholicism didn't make sense to me. And I started to question and to say, well, really, I don't know if something like that could actually be true. And I started to more like doubt it. But other parts not. I always enjoyed like the idea of thinking there was a God that sort of, you know, I could talk to. When I was a little girl, that gave me a lot of a good feeling. I felt confident, feeling that was a higher power, let's say. And then it was until later that I became a teenager that I started to, you know, well, my dad is an atheist, but like a really like hardcore atheist. My mother more agnostic. And then I started to see that there was apparently like a conflict, but I don't think there was a conflict in the way I looked at things, because, you know, I see everything as part of the universe, I guess. You know, um, you don't need to make a division between this is natural, the atoms and fields are nature, but if there's something more, let's say, then like a spark that brings in life or whatever. I'm just like making that up. Like we were just talking, then that is like a supernatural, or that is from a. No, I mean, it would all be part of the universe if that's the way it is. I mean, what's kind of fun is to try to figure out, you know, what is the universe, and is there more than what we can see? There's so much more than what we can see. We know that even with quantum mechanics, right? We don't see quantum mechanics on our daily basis, but we know it's there because of our ideas and mathematics and theory and then experiments. So I think thinking that this is the physical world and there's nothing else is kind of a bit too soon to to rule out other things. Maybe
Yeah,
no.
I've kind of like been trying on this weird axiology where I see biology as kind of the uber science that actually integrates physics and chemistry and, you know, psychology and sociology and culture, and it's like it's bringing in some of these things that perhaps would have been given to the church at one point in time. Like if you were talking about an animal's motivation and its will to survive and all this stuff, but now you're talking about human beings, it's almost like doing something that perhaps the church would have. Like that's interesting how you mentioned how they divided up the kingdom. Like science, you take the atoms and stuff like that, and the church will take care of everything else. But then both of them kind of crept into each other's domain, because like you said, there's these things you read about in the Catholic tradition, like the virgin birth or whatever it is, these miracles that are they're kind of creeping into the atom world, where they're saying there's these miraculous material events that are happening, and you're like, I don't know if that makes sense. But then science also creeps into like the religious domain in some sense as well. I feel like this topic consciousness is kind of the bridge where science is starting to be like, we can handle some of that stuff maybe a little bit.
It's like a very unnatural division, right? And I think that's where the conflicts come, is that, okay, maybe at the time they thought this is going to resolve some issues, but the division is completely unnatural. And then became really interesting. That I guess that's why it was a taboo to talk about consciousness if you were a physicist. And if you did that, then people would say, oh, you're a crackpot and you're not to be taken seriously and you're a mystic. Or, you know, I've heard comments like that from really like David Bohm, for example, right? And he's a mystic, but he was a very good scientist as well. and made very important contributions to quantum mechanics at its early stages and still like in its late stages as well. So kind of putting these labels, and then what that does is that you become afraid of talking about these topics because of course nobody wants to be called a crackpot, and you are also, you take care of your reputation, you want to be taken seriously as a scientist, and so on. And I think Roger Penrose was the first one, or maybe not the first one, but very prominent. He's just kind of taking a stand and say, look, this is like the elephant in the room. We're all conscious. We're all experiencing this. And why should we just say it doesn't belong to science? It should be part of science. But I guess that had a cost on him. I suppose a lot of people also, say things about him that he felt sometimes.
It seems more acceptable now than ever, though. Like if I think about even when I was in
Yeah.
college, in the early 2000s, or coming up in high school and stuff, like consciousness wasn't something that science really dealt with. There was the new field of neuroscience was coming about, but it was still like, what are the cells doing? And maybe there was like some behavior psychology, but the idea that there would be any consideration of this meta process in terms of what's playing out on the actual physical landscape, these almost applying like quantum mechanical pictures, physical pictures to it.
So I think
Yeah.
something actually really crazy happened that made science, and I'm speculating here a little bit, but there was a moment where the hard problem of consciousness was formulated for the first time, which was basically like, humans have something that nobody else has. How did that happen? And when you put it into that frame, all of a sudden you can study it because you're like, oh, it's not this universal thing. It's not something that spans from whatever came before the first cells in a continuous line that's inexorably linked to life. No, it's something special that humans have, and now we can put it in a box and we can study it. And I think that might be why it suddenly became something that was polite to talk about, because it was formulated in a way that created a problem to study, as opposed to seeing it the way that you're saying.
Okay, yes. I mean, and I think also like Roger changed that as well, I mean, he took this risk to go out there and to say, no, well, these are my ideas. He wrote The Emperor's New Mind, and he was very heavily criticized. But with time, other people started to find this is a topic that is interesting and felt maybe a little braver to discuss it because, come on, I mean, if Roger talks about it, like other people can talk about it too. And I think that also contributed, that he took that risk and he was brave enough to bring it into the scientific arena. And now, well, I've been participating in this festival that I love in England, How the Light Gets In, and we have many debates with philosophers and so on. I really enjoy talking to philosophers, and consciousness is a topic that comes out in many discussions. And now, like you were saying, it's now more acceptable to talk about it. You still have to be careful, I think, with what you say. It's not kind of completely, risk-free, but more people do it. But what I have noticed in the festival, which is amazing, is that there is such an appetite for it. I mean, this is what I get from the audience. No, I mean, they like to ask questions about it, even if it's not brought up in a debate. They will ask questions, but especially like when you leave the debate and then you go to the bookstore to engage with the public and talk to them, everybody wants to know about it. This is what I get, because everybody asks, what do you think about this? And it's like, wow, I can really feel that the general public has a huge appetite for answers and for discussion and for making it more like a normal, part of a normal discussion.
What's
Not
the
hearing as well.
general theme of their questions? Like, do they want to know where the self comes from, or the soul, or the like where does the spark sit, or something? Like, what? Why would you ask a physicist about something regarding the soul? Like, why do you think that they're
Yeah.
attracted to that angle?
Well, I mean, I think there's a wide range of things. I mean, some people are fans of Roger, and part of what they really like about Roger's work is that he said, no, that when the collapse of the wave function, when the wave function collapses due to gravity, there's like a proto thing of consciousness kind of emerging from that. And so some people want to understand that better. But other people also want to understand if AI will be conscious. This is, of course, a super big topic at the moment. So that's another angle where they might, be interested in asking. The other thing I think I get, they just want to know how you think. They just ask, so what do you think about it? I get that a lot. There are some other events where you sit down and you have a breakfast or a meal with a group of people, and that's what they want to talk about. They want to know what is one's personal take on it. But it's also not well defined. I mean, when you talk about consciousness with philosophers and physicists and computer scientists and so on, everybody defines it in a different way. And there is, in my opinion, no agreement on it. I don't think even I agree with Roger on how he defines consciousness. So even that is an interesting, topic, because I would guess that some people would say consciousness has nothing to do with a soul. There's nothing special about consciousness. It's just something that, when you get many bits of information working together, suddenly consciousness just emerges, right? And so this is
Do you think they
many.
mean in that sense like awareness, like self-awareness, or just
Yeah.
awareness in general? Is that kind of what they mean?
Well, I mean, that's the point, is that some of them mean different things, no? So it depends what I mean, I've heard some people working in computer science talk about, they try to frame consciousness in a mathematical way to, kind of come up with a theory of it, and maybe ask questions like, can AI be conscious or not? And then they'll say things like, okay, there are these properties of a bunch of bits or qubits, or but just in a computer, and they have this idea that, well, consciousness cannot be like a local thing because that would be strange, so probably something kind of global on the bunch of bits. So let's write mathematically like a function, and so on. And then you ask the question, but why would, okay, yes, maybe the idea that it's something sort of global rather than local, a good sort of characteristic to associate with consciousness, but why do you assume that your function is consciousness? I mean, how do you make that connection? And that connection is just a guess. I don't see a reasonable logic in just saying, just because this behaves in a collective way, then obviously this has to be consciousness. No? So that's why I was.
Do you know Michael Levin?
I've heard of him.
Okay.
Yes.
He has a really interesting take on all of this, and he's been doing these simulation experiments where he has some interesting mathematical approaches to drawing the threshold of where this, pseudo conscious entity appears, basically showing that there's some layer of causal agency that appears that wasn't there before. So in other words, like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you have these individual, very simple molecular like elements, then the way that they interact produces some larger scale that has, in some sense, more relationships to its parts than it does. Sorry, it has. Nastia, help me out here.
It's able to maintain a sense of the whole even as you take pieces out. And so basically what he does is he has these networks of chemicals, and he can show that they
Simulated
acquire
chemicals.
simulated chemicals. That's true. But he can show that in the simulations, you can teach them what looks like cognitive processes. They can habituate, they can
That's
associate,
right.
they can co-regulate, they can have some sort of response to the stimulus where, you have a chain where you have chemical A that produces chemical C, and then you trigger the node that's chemical B in parallel, and then initially it has nothing to do with the causal relationship, but you trigger them together enough times, and then all of a sudden you can remove chemical A, just trigger chemical B, and you produce chemical C. It's in the computer, and so I think that anything that's purely simulated you have to take with a grain of salt, but he's trying very, very hard to demonstrate that these notions of cognition that we associate with life,
With brains.
with brains, with cells, because I think that you can have cognition on the level of just a bacteria too. But he's trying to make
he would believe that, yeah.
He would,
but
yeah.
generally speaking, people think of, intelligence and
I know,
consciousness. Not generally, but a lot of people think of it as a human process.
I know.
But yeah, so Michael is arguing that it kind of emerges everywhere, like in some scale. Like the closer you look at things, the more you see something that approximates intelligence, even at really, really primitive rudimentary scales.
But for me, emergence is a funny thing, no? Because it sounds very scientific, and it sounds kind of very palatable, if you want to say. And you say, okay, I have all these qubits or bits or whatever you want, or neurons, and there are all these interactions. And at some point, if it's very sophisticated, consciousness emerges. And this is a very nice thing to say, nothing, because it sounds like magic to me. It doesn't explain how or why it emerges, just to say, oh, when you have something very sophisticated, it emerges. And I am not very sure that I agree with that.
Don't you think that it's missing this aspect of purpose? Like, it seems insane to me that consciousness would be something that has no purpose. That it's just, if you take enough pieces and you put them into an environment that's crowded enough that all of a sudden they develop this tendency. But if you look out into the worlds, the idea that consciousness and life are somehow associated with each other seems to mean that there is a function for consciousness, which is part of the function of life.
Okay,
and so if you try to divorce those, then can you get anywhere?
Yeah. I think that consciousness is something very simple, actually, okay, so again, I'm getting into territories. Like I have my physics hat. I've been using this hat in the
It's a really nice hat.
That's a cool hat.
Yeah, thank you. I really love it, and I took it to the festival because I was going to be talking about things I don't know very well. And then I was saying like how I feel confident with my hat, and when I'm talking about physics, because they're the things I know. But when I'm talking about things like consciousness, I definitely have to take it off because I'm talking about things I have no confidence in talking about. But I just brought it to one of the debates to make this distinction, and people loved it. And now when I'm walking around, they say, "Where's your hat? Please put your hat on." They really like it. So I brought it just in case, I wanted to introduce it. But yeah, right now, because I'm going to talk about things I don't know, I'm not going to put it on. But
we're all explorers here. We're exploring these ideas. We're not making any claims here.
Exactly. Yes. But so what I try to do about it is just to say, look, I want to have a clean go at it. I don't want to be influenced by what anybody else says. I don't want to be influenced by what Roger says. Sorry, Roger. I want to have my own go at it. And what I try to do is to make my own observations of it. So one of the observations I've made is that it's not a thought, in my opinion. So I think people confuse consciousness with thoughts. And let me tell you why I think there's different things. No, I think, and also I thought about this when I was a child, maybe because that's the way my father explained consciousness to me is like, okay, when you look at the mirror, you recognize yourself and you say, oh, yes, that's Yvette. Or because I think there were some experiments trying to find out, we can talk about animals being conscious later because that you talked about it being human. But I think now that for us, people that live with animals, with a dog or with a cat, you see that it's so obvious that dogs and cats are also conscious. And then you think, well, but if a cat is conscious, what about a mouse? And then you can just go on with that. And it's another interesting topic, but I'm
Just
diverting.
in case we don't come back to it, they've shown that ants can identify themselves in the mirror.
Wow. Okay, so those are new experiments. But for me, it's obvious that like that's why I was telling you that I have the suspicion that life and consciousness are like really, kind of come somehow together. But of course, I don't. It's just my hunch that they're kind of related and connected. Maybe they can be the same thing at some point. I'm not sure, but well. Okay, but let me go back to the distinction that I see between consciousness and thought. Um, so also, for example, I was told as a child, consciousness is this ability that you have of being aware of your own existence. I said, yes, of course. I'm here. I'm aware of that. I'm Yvette, or I think whatever that is, and so on. And that's a thought, if I'm thinking about, oh, I'm here and I'm Yvette and I'm alive and I'm aware, it's a thought. But next thing I'm doing, I'm cooking and I'm thinking about my equations, and that thought is gone, but I'm still conscious. So thoughts are short lived. They emerge, I'm hungry, goes away, or you start having a thought about a fight you had with a colleague, and that can be quite long, but it's nice that after a while that thought is gone, right? So thoughts are short lived, but we're conscious all the time.
There's a really weird thing that I've noticed. There's a couple of sounds in our house that like for example, we have a faucet that drips. And I've had this experience multiple times that I wake up and there's a moment where I'm awake, but lacking some kind of full sense. The senses have not fully booted up. I'm aware of the fact that I am there. And then a few moments later, I start to hear the tap dripping. And so there's this latency between the moment of I am here, I am awake, it is morning, and the tap drips with enough frequency that I suddenly, or there's like like the fridge buzzes.
Yes.
And there's this moment right when I wake up where I don't hear the fridge buzzing, and then all of a sudden it boots completely and I hear it. And so that's a really weird liminal space.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I have things like I wake up and I'm just like, I just, there's like a blank, and then I remember like, oh, yes, here I am. Oh my God, I remember something. I remember like being a teenager and I broke up with my boyfriend and I woke up and I was feeling fine. And then suddenly, oh, I remember the right. I was like, no, tragic, tragedy. but there's this like moment that I can see when I wake up in which there's like a nothingness for a while, no? But
and anesthesia is kind of a weird example of this too, right? Where you can kind of turn off the neuron's ability to convey pain and experience consciousness, and then you boot the whole thing back up and like it still remembers what it is. Like the body, like you still are there. Like you've been gone, but now you're back. Where were you? Like, how do you stay encoded while all of your neurons are turned off?
Anesthesia is crazy because totally the fact that somebody's still there after you just knock them down and then you turn them back on and they're not just wiped clean, like an amnesia patient, is amazing.
But let me tell you something that's now more controversial, or at least controversial. Like I got into a fight with my dad over this one. Because I claim that that you're conscious when you're in deep sleep. And he got very angry at me and he said, of course not, what you're saying is nonsense. You have no idea what you're talking about. And it's like really difficult to, to explain. But that's why for me, consciousness is, well, it's not a thought. So for me, it's more from my observations. No? That's what I'm just saying, like from what I observe, is that it's more of a background. It's something that is always on. And because it's not, I mean, what's very complicated and very sophisticated, and that you could maybe write equations and model and everything are thoughts. But this background for me seems to be actually quite simple. And it's just this background that I'm looking at you, I'm hearing your voices, I'm feeling the temperature of the room. Maybe I have a physical sensation that comes from, my body. And all of this like ability to perceive, to be aware of all these stimuli or even of my own thoughts is kind of a background that is always there. But then, yes, I said this thing that was very, I think it could be very controversial for some people, that it's always on. And we got into a fight, and I was trying to explain. It's difficult to explain sometimes, especially when you're under this sort of tension. And then I had an idea on how to explain to him. It was, maybe he wasn't very happy about it, but I said, look, if you're in deep sleep and I come and I give you a big pinch, you want to bet that I wake you up? And he was like that. Okay. So I think it's like you're like a bit, so when you're in deep sleep, and I'm sure that the experts would disagree with me. I'm sure. I mean, I've talked to friends of mine that are, in the field of neurology and so on, and this is not how like the professionals look at it. That's why, I mean, it's kind of really my own way of thinking about it. But I think that you're like a bit like on a standby, right? So when you are in deep sleep, I think there's no brain, there's no thoughts. So that's it. You're like when a computer, when it's on a standby, no thoughts at all, nothing is happening. But if you touch something, boom, it will come on, no? So that's the way I see it.
Christoph Koch was kind of working on something like this where he was trying to figure out how to identify those that were in vegetative states that still had signs of consciousness versus those that were totally gone. And from what I remember of our conversation, they were actually making decent progress, where with EEGs and some machine learning, you could really differentiate between people that still had some processing happening, but were locked, because there's locked in syndrome. Somebody looks totally vegetative from the outside,
Yeah.
but they're in there. They're
Yes.
thinking, they're experiencing, time is passing for them, and so he thinks that there's some large number of people every single year that are incorrectly diagnosed.
You can also
Yes.
lose consciousness and not die, which is really crazy. Like I don't know if you've ever been knocked out before, but it's pretty weird. Like you like a lot of time may have passed, but it doesn't feel like it to you. Like when you come back, you're kind of like, oh, what happened? It doesn't, it feels like I mean, maybe it could feel like you've been gone for 100 years, but it could also feel like you're in a new place. It doesn't make sense to you. Like you really are unconscious in the most like you're not aware in the same way. Like no one's going to pinch you and wake you up if you've been hit over the head. But or had some, epileptic event or whatever it is that causes you to lose consciousness, or anesthesia is not anesthesia, is that the word? Yeah, anesthesia. So there are these places where you can lose consciousness and stay alive. That's pretty bizarre too.
Yeah. No, I think with anesthesia, what happens is that, okay, when, let's say in deep sleep, you can, well, sometimes you can't wake up people, right? Sometimes their sleep is so deep that it's pretty hard. But let's say in principle, you can wake people up, likely because the substances that help them kind of wake up are functioning normally. Whereas with anesthesia, you're affecting those, kind of substances and so on. So of course, I don't know how those things work properly, but I have had the experience of fainting, and that first, like I was nowhere. I just had no awareness at all, and then as I came back, the first thing I heard was people around me shouting, well, it felt like they were really far away, and I slowly were like the voices became louder and louder, and so like, oh, what happened? No, and they say, oh, you fainted. Oh wow. But the other experience I had was under anesthesia. That they I was put under anesthesia, and something went wrong, and I was aware of everything. It might have been a little bit like the experiences that you talk about, that uh, when somebody might be like in a coma, that they're actually like they can hear people and so on. I heard the doctor talk to the other doctors and tell them off and say, how did you do this and stuff like this,
Oh
and
my
I was like, oh
goodness.
my god, I don't know what
Oh,
happened,
that's so
but
bad.
I was hearing everything, but my eyes were shut and I couldn't move. So I don't know what kind of strange state I was, but there's a thoughts. No, in that moment, I remember having thoughts like saying like, "Oh my God, I hope this is not very serious." And also, so I also went back to my childhood and say, "God, please help the doctors figure this one out." Never found out what happened, but I was aware. Yeah, there are like funny sort of states of awareness, different sort of levels, and but they all have a little bit of like a thought process, right?
I guess it depends on like the level that you look at. Like I'm inclined to see the world the same as you, in that I have a hard time separating life from consciousness. And so I have to think that when we have these unconscious moments, whether it's anesthesia or getting or fainting or whatever, like that there's still parts of our body which are conscious in those processes. It might not be the higher brain that's able to map abstract narratives on top of what's happening to us, but like our heart, our intestines, our bladders, our vasculature seems to be acting in a coherent whole still. There's that causal emergence that's there in the Michael Levin sense.
Like the liver doesn't just get up and be like, all right, I'm out of here.
Right. Yeah. Not the whole body
Yeah.
doesn't take a nap, right? So
Yeah.
maybe, and it's hard to look at what's happening in the body as unconscious, right? It's these coordinated efforts. And the more you study biology and anatomy and physiology, the more miraculous and insane it all gets. Like, just study a freaking kidney sometime. It's just like, this is unbelievable what this thing is doing. It seems like a little brain. Like it's sorting out, so it's processing so much information about what's going on in your blood at all times, and keeping
Yes.
just perfect balance of this fluid that's bathing all of your cells around your body. I
And
mean, it's
sending all the signals back to the brain about what it needs
right,
to
and
do from the master regulatory
it's
switch.
just unbelievable. Yeah, it's sending notes back to the central switchboard. Like, it's just unbelievable, and all that's still happening while
Yeah.
you fainted, right, or while you're under
Yes.
anesthesia.
Yeah.
So I don't know if
Oh
consciousness
wow,
totally disappears.
that reminded me of something really crazy that happened to me once. So I think since I'm young, I have things that sometimes I'm not thinking, and just talking to colleagues and friends and so on. Not everybody has those experiences, and I don't know exactly why some people experience them more than others, but I can see that my head sometimes, especially if I'm stressed or something, is going on a loop, and I'm just thinking over this and this and this and that. But I can also sometimes have very few thoughts, or even periods of times where my impression is that there's no thought at all, and then suddenly I see something coming out like, oh, this is very stupid, or oh, I'm hungry. Oh, okay. But because there's so few of them that I can see when one or the other pops out. So I guess yes. So what happened to me was that I was trying to fall asleep, and I couldn't. So I tried to calm down my thought process to help me fall asleep. So I was in this state which is very relaxed, and like I said, I have this sensation that very few thoughts are popping out, and so on. And then suddenly my husband made a noise. I think he snored a little bit. But then I saw the thought said, that was your husband. And I was like, what? That was, and suddenly, I don't know, I started to
As opposed to
think
like
about
that was my husband. The thought was that was your
that.
husband.
No, yeah, no, it was like that was not you.
Mm.
So my thought said basically that was not you, that was the other. Which made me think, could it be like our brains are these like very sophisticated computers, but part of it is kind of telling you what's you and what's not you?
Hmm.
I don't know. I that crossed my mind because it was just so clear, and I thought, okay, maybe. I mean, and I have also been in other. This doesn't happen very often to me. Okay, I mean, it's not like this is. I experience these things very rarely, but also things like I had a sensation in my stomach, and kind of the thought was saying like that's your stomach. And I was like, oh wow! I mean, that's kind of funny. So I thought, oh, maybe these thoughts are making us have like a sense of reality of, and it's also the separation, right? And maybe this computer up here is saying like, this is self, this is not self, this is good, this is not good, this is your arm, that's your foot. I don't know.
So there's a
Okay.
lady, Jill Bolte Taylor, who is a neuroscientist who had a massive left hemisphere stroke that took her entire left hemisphere offline. And so all of the sudden, her right hemisphere was completely in charge of everything. And the ability to differentiate between self and other completely vanished.
Oh wow.
And
Okay.
so she recognized that she was having a stroke, and she knew that she had to get to the phone to call somebody because she was alone. But every time that she would try to do something, she would just be completely lost in the sensation that everything was one object. And so the process of getting to the telephone was almost impossible because she would reach out her hand and realize that her hand never ended and the other thing never began. And so she talks about it very beautifully. And so I think it might be interesting if you
Wow. Yes. Yes.
if you shared
I've
that.
never heard of anything like that, but that is like I would like to hear more about it because it's yeah, I was really shocked with that experience. It just made me think it's like, oh, could it be that this whole separation and things like that is just because we have like a programmed mind, and it's kind of I like to think of, I mean, definitely, not in my day job, but as in the evenings and so on, I love to think about these sort of questions.
Okay, but I was actually going to ask you about that. Like, don't you, because we started this conversation by saying that the quantum physicists actually had this like deep spiritual perspective on the world, and they were preoccupied with this question of consciousness and how it played out. And it's hard for me to not see the formulations of quantum mechanics as being influenced by this nearly mystical perspective on consciousness. And so when you say that, I do this in my off time, not during my day job, does that mean that you're just a radically different type of physicist that's able to fully divorce one from the other? Yeah, exactly. It's time for the hat.
Yes, I totally do. I don't know how I do it. I absolutely do it completely. It's time for the hat. Yeah, let's bring the hat off. I guess it's like I okay. So first I had this like I was brought up in I feel like quite normal hearing about God, like most Mexican families would, to some extent, to some degree or the other. But then I started to study physics at the university, and that's where you also encounter more people that are atheists and that say that obviously all these things about the virgin birth are nonsense, and you think about it and say, well, yes, perhaps it's quite healthy to um, question all of these things. I actually wasn't a Catholic because my parents weren't, and my parents decided not to educate me in any with religion. But my grandmother's always tried to pull me a little bit, especially my mom's mother. She would take me to church when my mom was not around. So I had a bit of the two worlds, but then I just I started to study physics, and then I became an atheist for a while too. I mean, I kind of started to question everything, and I think it's a very good thing to question things as far as you can. And then I became a 100% materialist physicist, like what's the word, physicalists and so on, like most physicists, I would say, or like that's how you learn things at the university as well, that the universe is made of atoms and fields and so on. And I learned how to do physics like well. And for me to do physics well is with a mathematics rigor. So you can be very creative and have very good ideas and so on, but then you need to put them in a mathematical way and, work out the math in a rigorous way. And so on. And then also on the other side, there could be the experiments. No, so you propose experiments. Not in all fields it's easy to propose experiments. Like in the search for quantum gravity, it's particularly difficult to propose experiments. But I studied a PhD in quantum optics, where one of the wonderful things about the field is that there are many beautiful experiments, and then theorists and experimentalists can work together, and you can see in your own career and your life some of your theories being tested. So I've had some papers that later on were tested in the lab and confirmed and things like that. So that's really like very special about quantum optics. And there are many other fields that have that, let's say, privilege. And that's another way of being rigorous with your science. I mean, okay, I propose a crazy idea, but it's rigorous mathematically, it's rigorous logically, and it can be tested in the experiment. And so I know how to do that very well, and I keep within those boundaries. Also, for example, um, if I'm going to propose something new, I am very careful with it, in the sense that I try to make like little steps. So let's say this is like a physics that is I guess, accepted or considered, the status quo and so on. And I like to dance in the perimeter of that. Maybe take a little step out, but cautiously, and prove mathematically and that it makes sense and so on. And now I'm going to. I think we were talking about that. I'm going to come up with a paper that maybe takes a little bit, but it's still close to it, right? The thing is that you go to university and you learn this is quantum mechanics. Learn to work with it. Okay. I mean, there's the interpretations, but the mathematical formalism, is quite well established and so on. And then same with the general relativity. And then you work with theories by combining them and so on. But coming up with something controversial, I haven't done yet so far, but I'm going to take my first step out, I hope soon. And it's not so, I mean, I don't see it as something like really big. It is a little step, but I'm going to motivate it very well. So with logic, and then treat it rigorously mathematically, and then propose an experiment. And I'm working with the experimentalists that are going to test the ideas. So, and that's the way I work when I have my hat on. And yeah.
Do you think
Yes.
that that's how it's kind of gone in general? Is that these advancements have been incremental, like go outside of the box a little bit, then maybe step back in the box? It seems like a case could be made that science has, or physics in general in the 20th century, unfolded this way. But at the same time, there's this moment, which is really bizarre at the beginning of the 20th century, where there's these huge new ideas too. Like,
Yeah.
huge.
Specifically, there's a moment where it feels like there's this transition from a materialist physics to a mathematical physics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
Well,
that's
yes,
so far outside the box, right? It just seems like so far out there that there must be moments where people can make huge steps and still see those taken on board as a legitimate new frame.
But let's think about, like, it's sometimes it's hard to define what is a big step and what's a little step, I suppose, because if you think about like how quantum mechanics started to develop, there was the problem of the black body radiation, right? People thought at the end of the 1800s that, okay, with Maxwell's equations for electrodynamics and Newton's laws, we know all the physics we need to know, and then all the other problems are just very difficult problems mathematically, but we will eventually solve them, and that's it. And then there was the black body radiation problem that was not, people could not explain the observations with the theories, the Newtonian, the Newtonian physics and electro dynamics.
Can
So
you frame the black body problem for people who might not know too much about it?
yes, of course. So you have a body, and the body is going to radiate depending on its temperature. So you probably have seen when people heat metals, for example, that they start glowing in red. And then if the temperature is higher, it starts kind of changing color and so on. So we also radiate, only that our radiation is in the infrared. And you probably also have seen, our own radiation with the infrared cameras and so on. So all matter radiates depending on its temperature. And well, yes, the observation was that you increase the temperature, and then the frequency of the radiation sort of increases. But the previous theory, the classical theory, would predict that no, like if you keep increasing the temperature, the frequency keeps growing. So that's called like the ultraviolet catastrophe, because it would just grow and grow and grow and grow. And that was actually not observed. What's observed is a bell. So at some point, yes, you peak, but then it starts to fall. So Planck was trying to resolve that problem and explain the observations, and it's impossible with classical physics. And that's where he thought, well, let me make a little change, right? I don't know if he saw it as a little change or as a big change. We know now that it was a humongous change, but I don't know if at the moment for him it felt like a huge change. But what he said is
It
that,
did, because if you go to his biography, he's like, I was tortured by the fact that I had no idea what it meant.
yeah,
He was like, I figured out this thing that I could add to the math, and it made the ultraviolet catastrophe go away. And
yeah,
it seemed to be really important, but I had no idea what it meant.
yeah. Yes, but I mean, maybe mathematically was not such a big thing, I don't know.
He seems to have recognized. So this is actually a thing that I think is really crazy and important too, which is I think that these people at the turn of the century were completely suffused by the sense that they were making the first kind of new physics since Newton.
Mhm.
Like, I just
Yeah,
get the feeling that Newton was a god to all of them.
yeah,
And then
yes,
all of the sudden, they're in the position where they're like Newton. They're coming
yeah,
up with new laws of nature. Like, you can tell
yeah,
that they just have this frisson of self-satisfaction of like, oh, we have made something
yeah.
incredible.
Nothing can be more exciting now.
Yeah.
That being at that time where like the birth of a whole new understanding of nature, uh, super exciting.
Well,
Yes, but that
yeah, go ahead.
no, you please.
Well, I was just gonna say, so you kind of led to this point where it's not clear if he saw the significance of it, and I think that from reading their papers, it seems like they're literally in their own writing of their own experiences.
Yes.
They're describing this as being just not since Newton had anything like this ever been
Oh
seen.
no, that's for sure. No, what I thought, and I was just guessing, but you've read about it, so you know much better than me about this. But I was just thinking, if like when he said, well, there's this term that if I add it, if that felt at the moment as a very big thing or not. And then of course there was like when he looked at things, he realized how big it was. But I don't know if he wrote the details about it. You definitely know better than me about it, no? But what definitely happened afterwards, that people started to say, well, if you solve this problem with this idea, then Einstein said, well, maybe I can apply a similar idea to photoelectric effect, and that also worked. And then people started to contribute, and they started to develop the theory, and then they started to look at, oh my God, what did we do? No, I mean, the famous Schrödinger cat example, where Schrödinger gets super worried about this theory they just created, and says, look, this doesn't make sense, and look at the consequences that it could have if this theory is correct. It just doesn't make any physical sense as far as what we understand the physical world to be. And Einstein saying, I can't believe God plays dice, and all of that. So they created the theory, and then they looked back at it, and some of them just really didn't like what they had created, no?
Well, it's really weird because they created a theory that is purely mathematical in nature. Like,
Mhm.
I was reading about the gyromagnetic ratio of the electron, right? Which is this thing that there's a thing called Larmor precession, which basically tells you the ratio of the, if you have a charged particle that is behaving classically in a magnetic field, and that it's moving, it creates a little magnet, and the ratio of the strength of that magnet with how much it'll rotate is related by a factor of 1 to its charge to mass ratio. And so Joseph Larmor is like, okay, so if there's this classically behaving particle inside the atom, it's going to have this ratio. And then they try to do all of these experiments to show that, to actually test to see what it is. And it's really funny because Einstein does an experiment to test this, and he comes up with a classical ratio, because it turns out that it's unbelievably difficult to actually look at what the electron is doing. But the basis of the experiment is that you look at the angular momentum of an iron bar suspended inside of a solenoid. Because the idea is that if it's classically rotating, or if it's classically orbiting, that you'll have some difference between the magnetic strength that emerges and how much it twists. They can't end. They end up doing the experiment incorrectly because the magnetic field strength of the Earth is sufficient that it gets in the way of being able to actually make this tiny measurement. But what's weird is that when we talk about something like spin, we're this isn't a physical quality. And yet when we talk about the gyromagnetic ratio of the electron, what we're doing is we're measuring a physical quality, which is its angular momentum relative to its magnetic field strength. And so it feels like there's this weird rupture where on one hand, it's an abstract mathematical concept that has no bearing on reality. And then on the other hand, you're like, well, hold on a second. You can do an experiment where you make all the electrons in the iron bar do a thing, and then you can measure their angular momentum. So
Yes. Okay,
which is it?
Physicists look at this very differently, right? And that's where we all have different interpretations and understanding of the theory. Did you see this paper that came out? I think it's in Nature. That was like a poll, and they asked us all, "What do you think about which is the right interpretation?" And that's a really interesting. You can see that there's absolutely no consensus.
What was the interpretation of? Was it a specific experiment?
Yeah, so no, just quantum mechanics. So is it many worlds? Is it Bohmian mechanics? Is it Copenhagen interpretation? Is it collapse? And everybody voted, and no consensus. No, but so what I'm going to say is, so of course my own take at it, but I think, and in this I agree with Roger Penrose, is that there are two different types of reality. So one is the classical reality, which is the one that we experience, and then there's a quantum reality that, for me, is as physical as the classical reality. It's just that you don't experience it directly, because we are at different scales, or we can talk about why we don't experience it directly as well. That's kind of part of the interesting story, no? But and I think that these two realities obviously interact, because I can go to the lab, well, not me, but my colleagues, and prepare a superposition. So they can, as classical beings, they put their lasers and they build their beam splitters, and they can create superposition. So that's something that is physical in the quantum reality. And then, you make measurements. So kind of it goes, there is obviously an interaction between these two realities. And about the mathematics, is that what happens is that we have a beautiful mathematical formalism that works very well. And by it works very well, I mean that if you use the mathematical formalism to make predictions of experiments, you will find the results with an accuracy that's higher than anything else before. But not only that, is that we have lasers thanks to quantum mechanics. So you can physically see it, right? I mean, you can physically see something new that was invented, constructed, developed thanks to the new physics. So there's obviously something physical about it, something correct about it. But it's not a theory yet, in the sense that a theory would be a mathematical formalism. So let's think about Newton's equations, and you have like force equals mass times acceleration. So you have, a constant, your m, and then the second derivative of x with respect to t. So that's your mathematical formalism, and you can solve that differential equation with initial conditions and so on. But then it becomes a theory when you say, oh, that m is the mass of the system. And the second derivative of x with respect to t is acceleration. So when we make this connection, we turn it into a theory. So this, one would say, a mathematical formalism. And that's also, I love to say that to my students, and mathematicians deal with all these mathematical structures and maybe with partial differential equations, and they do a lot of work on finding methods to resolve them and so on. The physicists are, for me, more like artists that say, oh, yes, that is the mass. And, it's the ones who connect with the reality. And that takes a lot of guessing and a lot of intuition and a lot of just, kind of playing in a way. But if you are a good physicist when you're able to do sort of these connections in a good way,
Well,
I
so
think.
So this is actually funny that you mention F equals ma, because I've been like obsessed with trying to figure out the significance of that equation and what it actually says about the world. And the Principia is a really weird document because Newton starts it. The first sentence of the Principia is that a quantity of matter that is bounded by a volume and density is matter. And I'm going to call that mass for the rest of the book. He's like, it's a quantity of stuff in a volume.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to basically use this substance to make all of these claims, one of which is this inertial claim. He's like, okay, so like something in motion will continue to be in motion, or something, if it is still, will continue to be still. But he has this weird asterisk where he's like, if you can assume that anything can be still in the first place. And so he's clearly thinking about something. But then he goes on to say that F equals ma is the amount of effort that you need to exert upon some amount of matter in order to change its tendency to stay in place or to stay in motion. And there's this weird piece of that seems so theoretical and disconnected from an explanation, because Newton, what makes matter heavy, what makes matter want to do that? And he never deals with it.
Yes.
He never, it's astounding to me that he manages to come up with such extraordinarily accurate equations.
But he kind of sets the culture for it too, because he even writes later on that it's not the job of the natural philosopher to supply explanations for these phenomena. It's just their job to inscribe the patterns and parameterize them with respect to real measurable variables, right?
Yo, that is such cope. Like, if you read the General Scholium, it is literally Newton. You can just tell that he's been tearing his hair out, because it's like he publishes it like 10 years. So he publishes the Principia. Then I think 10 years later, he publishes Optics. And then he publishes a second edition of the Principia. And this General Scholium is the appendix to the second edition of the Principia, where he's like, update, let's see what's happened in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And
It's really great that you point that out, because that's and when you're a student and if you go deep enough, you start noticing all these things. Whereas maybe when you're in high school and so on, you just okay, yeah, and whatever, you don't think about it so much. But well, at least this happened to me at university, that I started to see also with time. And later on, I started to work with clocks. So you say, okay, clocks are time is what a clock measures. I think as a physicist, like I'm happy with that definition. But then in your equation, there is a little t there, and you're like, but wait a minute, what? Like I'm saying that time is what the clock measures, but to describe the clock, I need a little t that I put into my equations so I can solve them. So what is this t then, if not time? And it becomes also like recurrent. I guess maybe a way of getting out of it, you would say, look, math is fundamental, and I don't need to tell you what it is, right? That would be
no, you can't do that.
no. I'm not saying that that's what you should do. I'm not saying that that's what you should do, but like when you start with you start with something, right? And that's like a bit with mathematics. You start with some axioms. And then you develop you kind of develop everything from there. So usually even in logic, and you have to start with some things that you're just saying that's the way it is, and then you build.
I guess it's a measurable quantity, right, at the heart of this thing that you're calling a theory, which is like a formalism applied to some measurable quantities which have some predictable relationship to one another. But I mean, I agree with Nastia. I think what she's getting at is, and I think we should move towards this idea of why you don't experience quantum reality. And I think that what Nastia is getting at is that because quantum reality is built on these somewhat undefined concepts like mass and charge and give me a couple more.
No, but she's saying that even you're saying that even in the classical sense it's not well defined, but that's like at the heart of my work now is like, okay, but now if you have a superposition, what's mass? So do you have 2 times the mass? I mean, you can have a particle being in many places at the same time according to the wave function. So what's mass in quantum mechanics, right?
I think you can get away with it in the classical systems because they're directly visualizable. Like you can just see a body on an inclined plane moving, and so like that there's some level of understanding that's possible, but when just by literally watching a phenomenon occur, but then
you're like, yeah, that's a mass. Why do I have to explain it to you? It's sitting on the table.
Yeah, it does a thing. Like we're all aware of it. It makes sense. And then when you start talking about the quantum reality, you actually you're talking about this abstract level of understanding because you can't see it. So you have to parameterize it in this other space, which might involve complex numbers. And you're really still relating the same variables that you had on the inclined plane, but the processes are not directly observable in the same visualizable sense. You can't just like watch an atom doing light with another atom. You're not, the scales, like you said, are incompatible with that kind of direct observation.
Okay.
I hate to use
but
that word.
what I was going to is that with quantum mechanics we have this very powerful mathematical formalism, and we don't have a theory yet because we're not able to say what the wave function is. So you pointed out already problems that could arise just with Newton's equations, but this is even further. Maybe one could argue in some way to get away with Newton's equations, either saying like, look, we went to the lab and we measured this and so on. I think a philosopher would always want to go deeper into things, and I like philosophical questions. So I'm a little bit on your camp, and I like to push it and think. But I mean, of course, also as a student in physics, I had to at some point say, look, just let's work with it. Otherwise, I have an exam tomorrow. But I like to go back to things, and I have done that in my career. Like I noticed as a student that I couldn't understand what time was, and then I said, okay, when I'm grown up, I'm going to work on time, and then I realized close to in my 40s that I was never going to grow up, so better start working with time now, or it's now or never.
I love that.
So I started to work with quantum clocks and things like that, trying to make sense. I learned a lot about clocks, and I still don't know what time is. But it's been fun. I don't think many, there's no consensus also on what is time. It's another of these very interesting questions in physics. But
What's the
anyway,
problem with like that? Like you said, physics often just the only thing you can get with a consensus is it's what your clock is doing. It seems like what bothers you about that definition?
no, it's not that well, no, what bothered me about it was that when I was sort of describing the clock, I mean, I was thinking, okay, I have this thing ticking, and the ticks are giving me, like, they have a frequency, and those are giving me like the time in a way. But the mathematical description of the clock has itself a parameter, which is, you know, part of the equations, which it's the time. So how can you be describing a clock to define what time is that uses a parameter which is time? So that's part of the problem that happens with it. I mean, or at least what we did, our description of, I know that there's many physicists working in time exactly because of that, because it's such an interesting question, and there's also many philosophers considering it. I mean, one of the really famous problems that you have with time is when you go to relativity, because you could say, okay, I'm an observer and I have a clock, and time is what my clock says. Like, forget the mathematical description of the clock. We just have a pendulum, and each time the pendulum clicks, that's our clock. We don't need to worry about the equations or the other issues I was talking about. That's our clock.
We'll just
But
compare
then,
everything to that clock and call that
yeah,
time.
yes. But then what you have in general relativity is that you can describe a physical event from a perspective of a different observer with its own time. And then the notion of what is simultaneous, so at the same time, loses, kind of meaning, especially when you think about all possible observers. And so there's this idea of the block universe, no, that you can't really describe simultaneous events in an absolute way. And then there's this whole kind of idea that time actually doesn't exist, because it's a funny concept as well.
Well, it's a funny conundrum even here on Earth, right? Because your clock isn't this objective thing. Like if you take even if you have like a really precise atomic clock, if you take it up on a mountain, it's going to go faster than if it's down here on the ground. Maybe just a little bit, but it's like, well, is that person on the mountain experiencing time differently? I mean, maybe it's just
Well, it
the
depends on
question.
how it plays out on the physical substrate. Because if you assume that the reason that the clock changes its speed is because there's gravitational effects on the atoms that are pumping away inside the heart of the cesium clock, then every single atom that's in your body is also doing something different.
Yeah.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you are enjoying it, and you have listened to a couple of other episodes, and you are at the point where you wonder, as you lie awake at night, what you can do to make sure that this project survives for the rest of time, then think no more and come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For 75 cents a week, you can keep us alive, afloat, and headed straight into the future. I'll see you there.
I'm curious where you stand right now with this time question. You said you haven't quite solved the matter for yourself, but maybe you've made some progress.
Well, what I did, I became interested in time at the interface of quantum mechanics and general relativity, because I feel that that's where the issues are. And well, in general relativity, when you talk about proper time and so on, usually, the textbook says a clock is a point-like system, and it follows this world line, and then you can, mathematically integrate the trajectory, giving a background, a curve, a curved space-time. What's the proper time with respect to that world line? Or the example that you talked about the clock in the mountain. No, you could put the Schwarzschild metric and then see how a clock ticks at some distance from the surface of the earth, and so on. It's kind of the same thing. And then, but I thought, well, I mean, clocks are not point-like, so I was curious to find out what happens if you put like a real system there with a physical extension and so on. And because I work in quantum mechanics and now that's what I like, I thought, well, why not just go and put a quantum clock and see what happens. Actually, that's a funny story there, because I started to look into the literature and see who else have thought about this and worked on it. And I found papers by my ex-husband. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should have. No, then I looked at the dates, and it was when we were married. And I was like, maybe that explains. I'm just joking. But it was like a bit of a shock to see that
Wow, how
that he had been
scandalous.
working. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. I shouldn't say this, but I find it a funny story. And then I said, well, I'm gonna do better than him, and I'm gonna put a quantum clock in there. He works in gravity, and we get along very well. He's a very good teacher and has some wonderful research ideas as well. But it was funny. So I saw that there was, he had done this some work, and other people as well, and putting like a clock there with a physical extension. And I had been working on cavities with a quantum field inside, like so two mirrors, and then the electromagnetic field quantized inside. So this is very standard from quantum optics. But what I had been doing for many years was thinking about how these cavities can move. So the motion of these boundary conditions of the mirrors and the fields inside is called the dynamical Casimir effect. I was interested in that, but if the space-time was curved, and what would happen to the field inside the cavity if you moved it along a world line. And I had spent many years with my students and postdocs and colleagues describing all of this mathematically. Actually, it was quite involved, the mathematics for describing the motion in a general curved space-time. Actually, you can't do it in general, but we did a lot of progress doing that. And then, Einstein had used a clock that was like two mirrors and then a photon bouncing back and forth. And he used that clock model to, discuss a number of things in general relativity. So it was kind of similar, but in this case, you had like a field and it was quantized. And then you can take a frequency and say, and then you can construct a quantum state of the photons. Let's say you pick red photons or just any frequency, and then you prepare a special quantum state. So, for example, we call them a squeeze state or a coherent state. So these are special like quantum superpositions of the number of photons in those of that particular frequency. But those states oscillate. So those are like the tickings of the clock. And then I was able to describe the tickings of the clock that when you move the cavity along a world line. So that's exactly what I wanted to do. Of being able to say how the ticking of the clock changes, because the system is a physical system. It has an extension and extended. It has physical properties. And I was very happy with the results. I mean, we found that when you move the cavity, it creates particles that people know. But, in this case, the dynamical Casimir effect is that you move the mirrors and that creates particles out of the quantum vacuum, let's say. And it's basically because the vacuum state of the cavity changes when you move it. So from a perspective moving with the cavity, you see like particles in the cavity. And then we found out these are like, it's a quantum effect, but it's also a relativistic effect. And we saw how that made time dilation even more slow. No, so you had like a quantum effect, which was particle creation from a moving boundary condition affecting the ticking of the clock, making it even sort of slower. So it was kind of a accomplishment from a mathematical point of view only, just to be able to describe these things, and we found fun results like that. But I felt like I learned about clocks in the interface, but it doesn't necessarily the question about what is time and if time really is a real thing, or is it more something that is kind of an illusion, like Einstein used to say, it's a persistent illusion. It didn't really help me answer the questions, the philosophical questions. I still don't know very well if time is a real thing or not. I mean, I of course experience it as a real thing, and I think there's been, with general relativity and cosmology and so on, a move from the community to say no, time is really just an illusion. You can't really talk about it in a in a sensible way. But I have would like if once we put the theories together, let's say, I would favor more like a real description of time that makes sense, but not
Did
not
they
that
say
I
it's an
have that
illusion
yet.
because they can't objectively define it? Like there's no, it's kind of like
There's no
the
absolute time.
yeah, like there's no background time or something, like wherever your clock is, it's going to be like you just said, it's going to affect the local quantum universe, and it's also going to affect the clock depending on its proximity to other
Yeah.
bodies in this like curved space. And so is it just a matter of not being able to have this kind of background time? Is that what they mean?
I mean, it's a notion from general relativity. It is not talking about quantum clocks in particular, just normal general relativity. All the different observers would, have a different rate of ticking of their clocks. So what they say, oh, these two events happen at the same time. Another observer would say, no, they did this one happened before that one. And then think about all possible observers, and they all would disagree on what is simultaneous or not. No, so the idea of now in a global sense doesn't make sense. I mean, because if we want to talk about now, we would say, okay, you have a clock and I have a clock, and maybe we send a photon, and we know how fast the photons travel, so we can define a now between like you and me. Um, but it becomes when you think about talking about a simultaneous event globally, and you don't have one observer, it's not going to be preferent in flat space. All observers are there's not one preferent than others, inertial observers, of course. And in curved space, you have that inertial observers see different vacua, so it's even more complicated. So the notion of simultaneously breaks down when you consider all the inertial observers.
Isn't that
So
a kind of measurement problem in a way? Like
in what sense?
oh, well, like in the sense that we can't really know when the clock, like the problem being that it's very difficult, if not bordering on impossible, under certain circumstances to synchronize two clocks exactly. So we can't ever really say when now is between two parties in some circumstances.
But there's also a philosophical break, right? So let's say that we're talking about something that distance is separated by light years. We were talking about this the other day.
I had this like poor student come up to me after class the other day, and she was like, because we were talking about the size of the galaxy, like thousands and thousands of light years, and she was like, so if something is happening and we see it and it's 10,000 light years away. Does that mean it was 10,000 years ago? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, so are they seeing the same thing about us? And then she's like, well, how can we ever know what's happening in the galaxy? And I'm like, yeah, it's horrible. It's a really big problem.
Yeah. No, it's quite crazy. But I think that general relativity has to be also modified in order to be unified with quantum mechanics. So, well, that brings a note to the question of I think that quantum mechanics is, let's say, incomplete. So this difficulty with connecting, the physical world and the mathematical formalism, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that we are not considering gravity. So I think that we cannot talk about quantum mechanics and gravity separately. I think you need to bring them together. And okay, so, Roger likes to say, should we quantize gravity or gravitize quantum mechanics? So I let me explain what that means, because I really like to put it that way. So he says, okay, which are the principles of quantum mechanics? Well, for example, the superposition principle, and states are vectors in the Hilbert space, and so on. And then you have the principles of general relativity. So say, for example, the equivalence principle, and so on. And well, quantizing gravity would mean you keep like fundamental the principles of quantum mechanics, and then you change general relativity to unify them. So that's kind of the program. I don't work on quantum gravity, but that's what I heard Roger say, that's kind of the program of maybe string theory or loop quantum gravity, the usual theories that we know of quantizing gravity. And then there's Roger says, well, maybe we should be gravitizing quantum theory the other way around, which means let's keep the principles of general relativity, because, he argues it's a very well tested theory, and quantum mechanics anyways has the measurement problem. So we know that there is a fundamental problem with quantum mechanics. Not everybody agrees. Some people don't see a measurement problem and think quantum mechanics is just fine as it is. But many others does see problems, and in particular the famous measurement problem. So then quantum mechanics should be modified anyway to explain measurements and what is the wave function, and so on. So that's why he favors gravitizing quantum theory, which would be in understanding the effects of gravity on quantum mechanics. And then he says that it's gravity that collapses the quantum states. No, so you have the principle of superposition in quantum mechanics. So a particle, for example, can be here and there at the same time, but we don't see that in the classical world. So then what Roger says, and also Diossi, there's actually Lajos Diossi proposed this idea 2 years before Roger, but they did it completely independently. So it's fair that I mentioned him as well, because Roger is kind of very well known and recognized. I mean, Diossi also in the scientific community, but we usually kind of talk about Roger in this context, and it's fair to, credit also Lajos Diossi for that idea, which I think it's excellent because
How do you spell that name? I haven't heard it before.
Diossi is Diossi, and it has an accent, I think in the O. I'll send it to you later. And his first name, I think it's spelled Lajos. Lajos.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Thank you.
Yes. So so the idea there, and I think it's a very good one, is you say, okay, in the quantum world, you think we think you can put electrons in superposition, atoms in superposition. Actually, the record is molecules in superposition. So that's been done by Markus Arndt, who is an experimentalist in Vienna. And he's been able to put keratin or some molecule like that with 2,000 atoms in a superposition. That's kind of the record. But the big difference between the microscopic world and the macroscopic world, where we don't see superpositions, is mass. So I think it's a good idea to say maybe gravity produces the collapse.
Can I back that up a little
Yes.
bit? Can you explain to me what it means to have 2,000 molecules in superposition? Like, what's the readout of how do you make that claim?
So 2,000 atoms in one molecule. So so what Marcus does, let's go first to the double slit experiment, maybe, or similar to that would be an interferometer. Well, okay, the double slit experiment is that you have, let's say, a wall with two holes, and then you send electrons, and if they behave classically, they would go either by one of the holes or the other. And then let's say they travel and they hit a screen. And if they behave classically, you would see like a distribution around up and a distribution around down. And that's it, as if they were like tennis balls or something like this. But if they're quantum and they can go in a superposition of the two holes at the same time, then as in waves, you would see an interference pattern at the screen in the wall. No? So if we did the same experiment with water or with light, we would see these fringes, like when you have that the waves constructively interfere and you see areas that are bright, and then they destructively interfere in other parts and you see the dark areas. So when you look at the screen, there's this patterns of light that are black and white, and this is the typical interference pattern of a wave. So that was a beautiful experiment proposed by Pauli, and that he said, okay, if the electrons behave quantum mechanically, this is a famous like particle wave duality, then they would you do an experiment and you would see this fringes, right? And that he did 100 years ago, no, more or less, I think, like 100 years ago, and then got the Nobel Prize in I think 2020, like in 1927, something like that. So really, like we're celebrating 100 years of those beautiful experiments. But since then, people have been doing them. Well, can we do it with something bigger? Can we do it with an atom? And go on like that. So Marcus has been able to take a molecule. Well, he has like an oven with many molecules and do the experiment and see the fringes. So the let's say the signature that the molecules have gone in a superposition of two different paths at the same time.
So this is like the Stern-Gerlach experiment had, which is this like very famous experiment that demonstrated that valence electrons had this weird angular momentum. And what they did is they basically had an oven that had silver in it, and then they would evaporate the silver and then presumably one at a time send these atoms through the magnet. He's doing the same sort of thing, but instead of putting them through a magnetic field, he's putting them through this diffraction generator.
Slit
Well,
thing?
yes. So he has so if you have molecules and you want to diffract them, you use a laser. This is really beautiful because if you have like let's say atoms, no, if you have light and you want to create an interference pattern, then you will use like matter. No, you will use mirrors and beam splitters, crystals, to take, let's say, a photon and make the photon. You first use a beam split. That's another way. I mean, you could do it with a double slit, the holes, but the way that we do both. Another similar experiment is called an interferometer. So what you do is, like, say you have a photon coming in and it hits a crystal. The crystal is called a beam splitter. And what it does is that it lets part of it reflect and part of it transmit. And then you have mirrors and you recombine. And when they two arms recombine, you measure, and what you get there are these fringes. So if you do that with photons, that's what LIGO is basically an interferometer using lasers in a different configuration, but it's also looking at this interference. So you'll use these crystals and mirrors to do interference with light, but you can also do interference with electrons or atoms or molecules, and the role of the beam splitter and the mirrors are fields, so they're lasers. So they create this sort of interferometers with lasers for molecules, and they see the typical interference pattern of a molecule going through a superposition.
What's the
So
readout at the back of the screen? Like, what's the equivalent of the screen when you have a 2,000 atom molecule? Is it just having a chemical reaction with something at the end, or
is it like actually the light is phasing? Because if you it sounds like you're saying that you shine a light through it, and then you pass the light through the system of the interferometer, and then you can show that there's some kind of interference pattern in the light as it's passed through the interferometer. And so I would imagine that you would have like, is he in like superposition inside of one of these molecules of 2,000 atoms, or there's? I'm sorry.
It's no. Yes, of course. Let's talk about it. You have the molecule, and the molecule is a massive molecule in the sense that it has inside its 2,000 atoms, and that whole molecule, he can put it in a superposition of the molecule goes through left and right at the same time, and then is through using fields is made to recombine again. I mean, I'm describing his experiment very roughly because in reality he has a double because molecules behave in a special way, and then he has different levels of refraction and so on. So it's not as simple as I describe it, but the principle is the same.
It sounds like we have to talk to Marcus.
You have to talk to Marcus. Yeah, their experiments are great. Yes, because sometimes I know, like, the principles of what they do, but the experimental details often depends a lot on the particular setting that they have. And, for example, I have my colleagues that work in experiments, and some of them use sometimes rubidium and some use sodium. And then how do you measure like one or the other can also depend on the particular setting that you have. But for example, one of my colleagues, Chris Westbrook, works at preparing quantum states using cold atoms. And what I know that he has is like a sort of camera that the atoms hit when they are released. In that case, because he has something that he releases. And then he can measure how many atoms hit where and with what momentum. And from there he reconstructs. So the particular method for measuring in Marcus Arndt, I don't know what he uses, but there are different ways. I mean, you have also detectors that click if something hits. So you can have a detector here and there, and then if the molecule hits, it will click. Or the system, that's what you do with photons. You have some detection method for the photons, and you get a click if it goes in that detector or another, and then from there you can reconstruct the interference pattern, and then you will see, is there like an interference pattern typical of quantum mechanics of going in superposition or not, because the state was classical. So these superpositions can be very fragile, and they can sort of, let's say, die, which means that at some point you will have the molecule or the atom just going in one trajectory, because any interaction, let's say, with the environment can, in a way, like measure the atom and make it like just take one particular trajectory instead of being in a superposition. So that's one of the difficulties of doing quantum experiments, but people have gotten really good at it now, is that they interact with the rest of the universe and molecules or other things around, and then the states, what we call collapse, which means they go in either one or the other direction.
Hey,
now
I meant to ask you something about the idea of superposition and this idea of time as being real. Like, if you have a superposition, does it demand that time is actually a thing that you can point to as being a real phenomenon? Because how would you say that something is truly superimposed or superposed if you
Yes.
can't say that it's happening at the exact same time?
So that's like really goes to this unresolved issue, and I can tell you a little bit about the different sort of resolutions that people consider, let's say. Um, Exactly, because we try to make sense of what it means to have a system being here and there at the same time, right? So, I mean, when you hear about quantum mechanics just superficially, you'll hear, oh, a particle can be at the left and the right at the same time. But this is not exactly true, because what is a superposition is the state of the system. No, so in quantum mechanics, to describe a state, we use the wave function. So this is a mathematical object that has some certain properties, and in particular, you can be left and right at the same time. But remember that we don't know what the wave function is. We've been trying to say what the wave function is for 100 years, and we disagree. So let me give you some examples. Uh, David Bohm developed Bohmian mechanics, and he used to say there is something missing. So there's an extra degrees of freedom. So there was, for example, some wave mechanics that said there's some kind of waves that guide the particles, and when you consider those waves, then like you're adding something extra. Then things are sort of explained and determined. So the let's say the ontology, the nature of the wave function would require also to come accompanied with these waves. Or there was hidden variables, and they would say, okay, you can't. The state actually has some extra physical variables, but they're hidden because we cannot see them for some strange reason. Seems a bit magical as well. And then you know exactly what is going to be the outcome of the system when it interacts with, let's say, the screen or something like that. There are other proposals that say, well, quantum mechanics actually is not talking about physics. It's just talking about a state of knowledge that we have of the physical system. So it's not really that the particle is here and there at the same time. It says nothing about it. It's more like other proposals. It's a statistical theory that only says, if I have many copies of this system, statistically, well, it will be, but it has nothing to say about like individual situations. And what's interesting is that these discussions started out as quantum mechanics was born, and people started to disagree on the meaning of things early on. And after 100 years, the only thing that has happened is that we have more and more and more interpretations. People just come up with another one and so on, and no consensus.
Do you have a preferred interpretation? How do you think about it? Yeah.
Well, I think that you cannot consider quantum mechanics on its own. It has to be together with gravity. So, in a sense, I don't think we're going to resolve the problems of quantum mechanics on its own without resolving the problem of, let's say, of quantum gravity or gravitizing quantum theory, one or the other. I think we will have to modify quantum mechanics to unify it with general relativity. But I also think that we will have to modify general relativity to unify it. I think both have to go. And maybe that brings also an interesting point about time, because Roger also points out that this idea of the collapse of the wave function due to gravity, the collapse itself is inconsistent again with relativity, for the same reason that we were talking about the observers. Now, if you think about, I have a superposition of left and right, and then suddenly there's a collapse, which means it will collapse to the right. It's not that I measured, is that gravity made it collapse to the right or to the left, and then it will be in a definite state. That seems to resolve why we see the classical world. So that seems to explain the transition between the quantum world and the classical world pretty well. But the problem is, well, one is that we haven't tested that in the experiment, so we don't know if that is if it works like that or not. But the other thing is that now, if you describe the collapse from the perspective of different observers, remember we were talking about how difficult it is to talk about something being simultaneous. So collapse makes sense, sort of in a say in a given reference frame, where you can say, okay, in this moment it collapsed here. But from the perspective of an observer moving with constant velocity, it would say, well, I mean, it's for this branch it collapsed, and here it's still in super. It cannot make sense. So for that, you also need to change somehow how we understand time in relativity to make it consistent to the collapse. So now Roger has been talking about time perhaps being retrocausal and flowing in the opposite direction. And when he brought this up, I thought, no, come on, Roger. I mean, I like your ideas and I spend a lot of time, talking with him, and most of the things I agree with him, but this one I just, no. No, I was very reluctant to it. I just didn't like it. I just felt like, no, you're just making this thing up too. But then I understood something. It took me a while. That what he meant is that in the quantum reality, time can flow in the opposite direction. In the classical world, there's an arrow of time, and things always go in from past to future. But I am open to the idea that in the quantum reality, things can be different. And I think that might be one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for us to make progress, because we want to describe a different physical reality. Many physicists would disagree with me that this is a different physical reality, but this is how I understand it. But we try to understand it in a way using concepts and notions that we have from the classical world. So in a way, we put too much of the classical world into the quantum world. We try to make the quantum world behave like we understand physics in the classical sense, because then you would say, wait a minute, you cannot have time flowing backwards. This is ridiculous. Yes, in the classical world, we see everything moving forwards, but I think this idea that in the quantum reality things can be different, I think it might open new ideas to consider things like that.
Well, if the quantum reality simply means this probabilistic abstract description of systems, isn't it possible that it's not really in conflict with the world of physical extension that we consider classical reality? Like, if this is just the way that we map these events is through this language of quantum mechanics, these abstract wave functions that have, imaginary components, and it is an abstraction as a platform, as a map.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea that you could probabilistically describe things with this parameter time doing things that don't have a classical reference point doesn't seem at odds. It doesn't even seem at odds with the fact that there might be a classical reality there, but your parameterization of the system doesn't allow you to access it as well.
Yes, and I know. So some colleagues of mine that we actually were postdocs at the Perimeter Institute, like Rob Speckens, for example, they defend points of view like that, to say there's nothing, kind of contradictory about quantum mechanics. It works perfectly well if you accept that it's just a probabilistic description of some physical situations. but I don't like. I mean, it's not sort of my taste. Is kind of taking the fun away. I don't know. I don't know, but it's not. It's not my preference. Let's say way around the problems in quantum mechanics. But
That's interesting.
it is a very valid one, and definitely worth considering and pushing and studying further. And I also remember at some point seeing some experiments that they were proposing to try to see if this was the right way of understanding quantum mechanics.
So when you think about quantum reality, do you prefer a more like enchanted, magical version where these unimaginable processes play out? Like they're sort of beyond the world in which we're used to living. Like there's just things are in two places at once, and there's just bizarre stuff. Like it's sort of an Alice in Wonderland place, or
Yeah, a little like I like Alice in Wonderland. Yes.
me too.
But maybe not so, yeah, maybe not so crazy. Actually, like the work that I'm going to put forward has an ingredient of that. And how it happened was that we were trying to make a progress in unifying, not with general relativity, but with Newtonian gravity. And that's already kind of the collapse that Roger talks about is is a Newtonian effect, actually, in the description that he's given so far, and that's also Diossi. It's not relativistic yet. So we were sort of working with that, and then we struggled, and we came to a point where we couldn't make progress. And then one of my students said, "Yes, of course, this is what you can't do that." And then I thought, like, why not? And then I realized, okay, yeah, you cannot do that definitely in the classical world. I'm not telling you what yet, because that will be our next meeting. I'm going to tell you what is it. So it's like a little bit of a teaser. But then that's where I realized, like, oh, yes, we're thinking classically in the quantum world. But I like Alice in Wonderland, but I also like Oz. And I thought, we're not in Kansas anymore. So I think we can allow for some things that are not like intuitive or allowed in the classical world to happen in the quantum world. Like, for example, maybe um, retrocausality could be a good example.
I mean, don't you think that the place where we started this conversation was that the old world quantum physicists had this almost mystical relationship to the foundations of reality. And so what they did is they came up with this astonishingly precise mathematical framework for describing what's happening, but they offered us no real clear insight for how to tie it to the world. Like they themselves didn't have the answers for this. And so
Yes.
here we are, 100 years later, people are sitting around, nobody really agrees. Let's set aside that they don't agree on what consciousness is, they don't even agree what the wave function is, which is at the center
Yeah.
of this entire endeavor. And
Yes.
I'm like, shouldn't our efforts be to take the Mad Hatter out of this situation, to like put the stopper back into the bottle that says drink me, and instead say, look, perhaps the mysticism belongs elsewhere. Like the mysticism is important. I always think about this from the standpoint that humans have never in the entire history of our development that I can tell ever survived without mysticism. There has to be
Mhm.
something weird that's happening somewhere, or we lose our minds. And so what we've done is the church and the science have separated. The educated people have started to say that this is supernatural, this is nonsensical, we don't need this, we're true atheists. But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that we have lost our need for some kind of supernatural aspect. And so, do we run the risk of putting ourselves down an even less legible path than we were put on 100 years ago if we allow supernaturalism and sort of this kind of weird Alice in Wonderland stuff to persist in the quantum world? Because, like, this is supposed to be the mechanism by which we understand the foundations of nature. There's so many people that you see, the mystics and the gurus and the philosophers and the counselors that are like, quantum physics says that you can manifest $1 billion today if you just buy my course for $3,999.
Oh,
And I'm like,
yeah,
is that not all somehow like tied together with this foundational mystery that's kind of maintained and
like if we
fertilized?
allow magic to happen inside of science.
But you see, this is why I like my hat so much, because I really feel safe when I put it on, I really feel very well when I put it on, because like what I want to do is like, maybe then I'm boring and I'm cautious, but I like to take these little steps, and I do like to bring in some new ingredients and, take a risk to do something, but to take it out there and to say that, something mystical is happening with quantum mechanics, that doesn't feel at all well for me, because I don't think it's necessary, or I don't know. This is why I like my hat. Like I like the way that I work, that I was telling you about the rigor with the mathematics and with the experiments. It makes me feel that I'm taking like good steps. Um, I don't know, because I really like what I mean that I do when I take it off is that I let my mind be more free, and I explore questions that maybe are philosophical or even beyond that, and I take these questions like really seriously, and I enjoy them. But I haven't been able to put these two worlds of mine together, and I don't think I'm ready to, because I wouldn't know how, as like, and I don't even know if they're connected in some way. I mean, what I mean is that the other world, let's say the questions I like to think about, well, what is the fabric of reality? And quantum mechanics there, okay, a little bit does tell you something about, well, what it mean, what's mass? That's the question that I like very much. What's mass? Because mass cannot be what we understand, the experience that we have, let's say in the classical world, that you have a particle in many places at the same time, a massive particle like the molecule that Marcus Arndt has in his lab. I don't think that when you're in the quantum reality and you have these superpositions, that mass is the same as we understand it in the classical world. This is a question that I am working on seriously, right? But it does tell you something about what is the fabric of reality in a way. But then, let's say in the evening, more philosophically, maybe I think, well, I mean, maybe there is a God, or there is a higher consciousness, or maybe there are some realities that we don't see and that we don't perceive, and maybe there's some sort of intelligence in other ways that are not conceivable to us. I mean, come on, I think we need to accept that we're very limited, right? I mean, we see only like a little bar, like in the spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies, and our senses are very limited. The band in which we hear. Our instruments are amazing, and the most sophisticated telescopes and sensors and everything that we have are as incredible as they are, and they let us see really far away into the past of the universe, and even see these amazing what you call them, from the galaxies, the
filaments.
The jets that
Oh,
come
the
out
jets.
megaparsecs like this. I mean, the instruments that we've built are just absolutely fabulous, and they let us see realities that we would have not believed before, but they're still limited. I mean, this is also like a good example, right? If you would have told people before they used the telescope to look into the sky that, Galileo did that, and by the way, many people didn't want to look through it, which was very interesting. if you would have told people before that, look, there are some things out there that are megaparsec, explain what that number is, right? These jets coming out of the galaxies, and they would have thought that is mystical, no? I mean, and that's just crazy. Unimaginable and so on, but then we built an instrument and we see it. So what maybe one day is something very mystical, then after we understand it better, it just loses that mysticism quality. And in particular, that could be consciousness, for example, that at some point we make progress in understanding better what it is, and then it maybe will not be such a strange thing. No, it won't be on the side of the church. Let's say it will be to be discussed by everyone.
Well, there's this. It's interesting because there's something about if somebody in Galileo's time says there are galaxies out there that have these enormous jets that.
First of all, they'd be like, "What's a galaxy?"
Sure, this
Yeah.
is true.
Yeah.
So fine.
Yeah.
Even the fact there's other galaxies out there. That sounds insane. Through the 1920s, we thought the Milky Way was the extent of the entire universe, which I think is a really important data point here as well. Like our sense of scale and
Gets bigger every year.
yeah, age and evolution and everything is insane. It's 100 years old. We're still young. But if you had told them that there was a galaxy out there and you went through the entire process of rearranging their brain after you exploded it by telling them about celestial mechanics, at some point there would be a telescope strong enough to be able to take a picture. You could put a telescope in your backyard, and if you have one of those mounts that tracks the sky, basically using your cell phone camera over the course of many nights, you can image galaxies. You can produce a photograph of that galaxy in the comfort of your own home, even if you live in a place like Los Angeles with a lot of light pollution. Okay. If somebody tells in Galileo's time, you know what? The stars are little golden orbs that these tiny dragons roll across the sky. And that's why they move. And there's this central star that everything moves around, and that's the queen dragon. And they do this dance every night. And then you looked through your telescope and you never found any dragons. That would be the thing that falls apart, because one thing sounds insane, but then you find incontrovertible evidence for it that everyone gets access to. And you can ask the question of, okay, how the hell do you make a galaxy? What is this entire process? Why is it that the age of the universe is supposed to be 13.8 billion years, but 200 million years after the universe begins, we already have fully formed galaxies, right? You start to go down this insane cascade of what are the specifics in the mechanisms. But there is something that is incontrovertible, and I wonder if we should not expect the same thing for quantum mechanics, which is that when you say that no one can agree on what the wave function is, no one can agree on what superposition is, or what a particle is even.
Yeah. Get.
Right? Like I have this feeling that we're still in this pre-paradigmatic state where you said accurately that there's not a theory yet, but perhaps the idea of how we differentiate between there's a galaxy out there versus there's a multitude of dragons rolling the stars around in the sky, like those are two different categories of statement that have some philosophical foundation for them being different kinds of statements.
Yes, and that goes to the rigor that I was talking about, right?
Yes.
I mean, and it again, it puts together the observation, so the experiment. So you can come up with all crazy ideas if you want to, but if you can see that actually, well, we built an instrument and we can see these lines and we can see this evidence, well, that's convincing, no? And I think also, like, I liked it when you said there's these two levels of description, no? One can still sound maybe like a little bit crazy that these little points that you see in the sky, they're just like the sun, only that they're very far away. And okay,
Like burn
maybe
the
at the
witch. That sounds
beginning this
insane.
sounds a little crazy, but then there's ways to test this, and this is at one level than the dragons, right? So I don't like it when people talk about quantum mechanics in this kind of way. They say, "Oh, scientists already showed that we're not going to die because no, we haven't showed that." No. So I think that's the dragon version of things, and that's where one has to be really careful. And that's what I like about science, is that it gives you this methodology and this rigor and these tools to, yes, I mean, of course, we have to be brave to accept that there's going to be things that we cannot, that we're going to find maybe crazy or a bit too much out there, but we have a method. We have the mathematics, and we have the experiment, and the theory and the logic, and I think that's why I like the again the hat, because that makes me feel safe. So yes, let's explore and let's be crazy and let's put in new ideas, but the wonderful thing is that this method allows you to take out of the equation some other things that are just not helpful, in my opinion.
Well, one thing that's interesting about this entire arc of progress is that at each stage, the crazy sounding thing turns out not to be true. So, like, the stars are these gods that are doing all this stuff and they have personalities and all this. It's like that. It turns out that the people who at the time are like, no, they're just burning rocks. Like, they're closer to that's a mundane thing. And yeah, it's heretical and it's not the popular opinion at the time, but it's far less crazy sounding at the end of the day. It's like a much more mundane solution. I feel like there's like something to be acknowledged in that story.
Yeah.
I really wanted to ask you about that. So I was like hoping you could talk me off of this bridge that I'm about to jump off of regarding Ptolemy, because you've mentioned several times like, okay, we can at least rely on our mathematical rigor, and I'm like, that sounds really good to me, except for this horrible story where these academics for 1,000 years developed really rigorous mathematics that was highly predictive for the solar system that turned out to be completely wrong.
Oh,
and
yeah.
and so I see this as a kind of cautionary tale about how
Mhm.
mathematics can lead you in a completely incorrect direction, despite being predictive,
Yeah.
despite being extremely precise and rigorous and
Yeah.
logical and based in firm evidence and axioms. Right? It's everything's
Yeah.
there, but you still
Yeah.
end up with the wrong conclusion. What do you make of
Yeah.
that?
No, I think these things happen. I mean, I think, yeah, mathematics is great, but like you said, we have that example where things can look like you have the right theory and you have a mistake. I guess then what happens is that if you do other type of observations, then you find out that that's not working there, and maybe that's similar to what we were talking about, coming back to black body radiation, when people thought we have everything understood in physics, but there is this little problem that we're actually not being able to describe with the theory, and then you discover kind of another level of description of things, right? So we need to be very careful. I agree with that, um, and not only look at the mathematics, but also the observation. In that case, is a great example, because there was the observation and the mathematics, and they seem to coincide very strongly. But then I guess you can make other sort of tests, and then you see that it was not quite that way, no?
Well, it's weird because Copernicus was making these revelations before there was a telescope to look at some pieces, which I agree did sway the public opinion eventually. Like, Galileo sees the phases of Venus, or he sees moons around Jupiter and realizes, like, okay, there's probably this kind of orbital thing that's happening, and we're off to the races. But the pushback against it was looking at the same data as everybody else. It was looking at the same mathematics as everybody else. And it was just imagining I think what I can't get in Copernicus's head, but I imagine he thought it was a simpler way of explaining what was happening, something like that. Maybe that's not quite the right way of putting it, but he certainly saw it in a completely different way. And he was like, the way that you guys are describing it is accurate and it's predictive and it's rigorous, but I think you're wrong still. And that's just something that, man, how do we protect ourselves against those kinds of landmines as we move forward, especially in these increasingly esoteric mathematical disciplines where you study for 20, 30 years to be able to apprehend the basic, what did we call it earlier? The mathematical formalisms necessary to even frame these, what you hope will become a theory. But at the end of the day, like, how many people are really participating in that to the extent that there can be a Copernicus who's like, wait a second, I see what you're saying, but I think there's a different way of looking at this.
Like, imagine the internal state of a Ptolemaic astronomer that has studied for an entire lifetime to be able to predict.
Yeah, he's got all the
mechanics of the
epicycles, like
stars.
incredibly powerful mathematics, super esoteric, difficult geometric relationships with, trigonometric rotation periods and like all this stuff. It was super advanced, actually. And then there's just some guy who's like a physician who's like, hey, I think you guys have it all wrong. He's
some worm that just arrives and is like, you experts don't have it right. Like, it boggles the mind that A, it is possible, and B, it seems absolutely impossible that anybody who's a Ptolemaic astronomer would be able to look at the ideas and say, oh, I think you're onto something.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and think about it like nowadays, you have people working on a theory and their family depends on that. Their whole life depends on, their income and so on. It's very difficult to get, kind of rid of that social situation. What I found, I mean, I was listening to some podcasts about string theory and so on. I didn't go into string theory when I was young because, first I'm a little bit of a contrary, so a contrarian. Everybody was going there, and I was like, oh, if you're all going there, I want to go somewhere else. I've always been a little bit like that, and I tell my students that sometimes socially it can make me a little awkward, but it has paid off when it comes to science. That's also not a necessarily good recipe, but in my case, it's been good. So everyone in my class that wanted to do theory went to do string theory. And I didn't like it exactly because I thought, how many dimensions? No, this sounds like the epicycles to me. And another dimension and another dimension and another circle. I mean, I thought the idea was beautiful. But then when I saw more of it and in practice, I felt, no, this can't be right. And I just went into quantum optics and quantum information and so on. Then I did a postdoc at the Perimeter Institute, and there were my friends were working in gravity, and I became very jealous of what they were doing. I was like, oh, I wish I was working on that. And I started to learn, and I started to mix them a little bit, and that's how I got started many years ago. But I wasn't really aware that it was a problem for most theoreticians that were interested in foundations of physics, not to go into string theory and not to follow the status quo, because the community would actually, and I saw people even saying it, would destroy you. Like maybe you came and you was a young student with new ideas. No, you're not allowed to have new ideas. You won't get a postdoc, you won't get a position. And you would have thought that these things were not real, but I heard stories and so on. And then even from talking about my ex-husband, I think now I look at his story from those eyes, and I think he was someone with very good ideas, but was doing something out of the status quo, and it was very difficult for him, extremely difficult for him. And then maybe you write some nice papers, but nobody cites them or nobody works on them because the whole community is working in a direction. But I heard some things that were really awful. about how people struggle. And then I thought, you know what, I was kind of lucky because I went through a little bit, but without realizing, I went into quantum optics and then I started to mix it, and now I'm coming back again in first circle. But I think I was very lucky that I didn't try something like that younger, and I managed to get, like the position that I have now, and survive academia. But I was really shocked when I heard those stories.
It must have been not too dissimilar in the Ptolemaic era. Like, it's centered in Alexandria, from what I understand. Ptolemy had this huge, the Ptolemaic astronomers had these huge star maps. All of the best way I can think about Alexandria in that time period would have been something like Oxford or Cambridge, right? It's the same sort of, it must have been a similar climate in which people are working on these large-scale projects together. They're collaborating. If they're not being cooperative, then they're considered as kind of unnecessary and kind of pushed out of the conversation. And I just wonder if this is just a necessary thing that has to happen. This is why our paradigms just crumble at some point, because we're not really capable of collaborating on these large projects unless we're all on the same page. But that unfortunately excludes people who might have actually valid perspectives sometimes. It's just a really unfortunate piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, if we're all on the same page, then you don't have the new input. If you're making progress and we're all on the same page, great. I think sometimes that happens to quantum optics because you have the theory and the experiment. The community is largely on the same page. They have been able, together with the experimentalists, make a lot of progress. And, people have gone from distributing entanglement in a tabletop experiment to now Anton Zeilinger, also from Vienna, and he got the Nobel Prize now in 2022. He can distribute entanglement between photons across thousands of kilometers using satellites. So that is an example of when you can work together and you're at the same page and you're making progress, which is a very good thing. But if you're stuck on something, then you need the strange one, the odd thinker, the one that thinks out of the box, and so on. And how do you listen to that if everybody has like, now here we're just going to be working with string theory or with loop quantum gravity, and we're not going to allow for anything. I mean, I've heard people working from string theory that they say, no, there's nothing out from here. All the other ideas are nonsense. And very dismissive of things and so on. And I think, well, given the success that the theory has, I don't think they should be so dismissive of other approaches. But on the other hand, I do understand as well the point of view of someone who has dedicated their whole life to develop, a theory and so on. And then, well, you don't want to be open to other ideas and so on because your world crumbles.
It seems like the more theoretical domains fall prey to this problem more easily, or they're at least more subject to this kind of dogmatism, because you're right, in the world of experimental physics, it's a lot easier to find something new about the system that you can objectively show your peers, and everybody can comment on it. I also did my PhD in experimental physics because I was like, this is cool. I can just actually report observations about a system nobody's talking about, and then we can go to conferences, we can write papers, we can talk about it, people can weigh in on it. But I think when you're purely in the realm of processing these mathematical formalisms, there's a sort of valence that opens up where people have to pick sides somewhat subjectively in terms of the direction. What do you value at that point? Do you value beauty? Because that's what the Ptolemaics did. Their solar system was beautiful. It traced out these incredible trochoidal, like almost like flower patterns. I mean, an argument, perfect circles, right? They thought the circle was God's most perfect shape. Like an argument can be made that they had a more beautiful model than these ugly ellipses with, off-center foci and all this stuff, right? So it's like, what is your guiding principle in the theoretical world, right? You can't, it's not necessarily experiments at some point.
Yeah. You know what? Because I had this kind of background in quantum optics, I was used to say that, okay, you come up with a new idea and you at least make an effort to propose an experiment. I set up this like really high bar to myself without noticing that actually most people working in theoretical physics and the foundational part was maybe not imposing in themselves, but I always had like, okay, I have this idea, and if I could not propose an experiment and actually put numbers and see this is in principle testable, I would not publish it. But this is because I was unaware of what other people were doing, and I was just kind of thinking about what other people were doing in quantum optics, and it was possible then, and I really put a lot of pressure on myself on propose an experiment. And I found it really difficult at some point in my career, because I came up with a bit of a crazy idea, which was that you could detect gravitational waves using a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a tiny system. So when I had this idea, they hadn't measured gravitational waves yet. It was like 2 or 3 years before they actually measured them. So I think I published the paper in 2014. I don't know how I came up with the idea one day. I just thought, wouldn't it be super cool if you could detect gravitation? I just noticed that these systems, so let me tell you a little bit what the system is. It's called Bose-Einstein condensate, and what it is that when you're in the second year, when you learn quantum mechanics, the typical example that you see of a quantum system is that you have like a well potential, and you study an atom in that well potential. And then you see that when the atom is very cold, it sort of goes into the ground state of the potential, and it actually becomes completely delocalized in the potential. So it's not left or right, but it's like everywhere in the potential. Now put 10 to the 5 atoms into the ground state. So because atoms are what we say bosons, they can all be in the same quantum state. They can all come down to the ground state. It's never purely the ground state, because we can never have anything at 0 temperature. The atoms have interactions between them. So they collide, for example, and then they create some sort of like quantum fluctuations on the state. So I imagine a Bose-Einstein condensate like the ocean. That's like the bulk of the BC, and then the little waves that are quantum in that case are these, they're called phonons, and they are due to the interatomic interactions. And I found that this system was very sensitive to gravity. You could prepare these phonons in a quantum state, and then if you had like a mass moving or something like this, the state of the system would change. So I looked at that and I said, well, I'm going to try to see if they can detect gravitational waves. And it was a very crazy idea. But with all the years I had developing the mathematics to describe these cavities moving in space-time, this was a very similar mathematical technique I needed. We could do it. And then I had a big team of students and postdocs, and I said, it's a crazy idea, but let's do it. And I had an intuition that this was going to work, and I thought it would be super cool. And we did the calculation, and it turned out that our calculation was showing that this apparently works. So I got super excited, and I wrote the paper, and I thought, oh, people are going to love it. Wow. Like, and then I experienced because, people think, no, to detect gravitational waves, you need LIGO. And LIGO is 3 kilometers, like each arm is 3 kilometers big, and like the lasers have to travel all that distance and so on. So you're nuts. And a little bit it happened to me, like people wouldn't want to look at it. But in that case, it's like, hey, look at the mathematics. Okay, there's nothing new in the mathematics. This is quantum field theory in curved spacetime. With the BC, here's the Hamiltonian. Here are the approximations. Here are the numbers. It's all there, but nobody wanted to look at it.
Did
And
you didn't run the experiments for this paper? You
it,
didn't.
it hasn't been done yet. It hasn't been done yet.
Is it expensive? Does it require a 3-kilometer track, or what's
No,
yeah?
no, it's like maybe like a £5 million thing, let's say, to build it, hire the people, all of that. No. But people are starting to, I mean, one of the things that, well, what I did is that I started to go and give talks everywhere about it. And at the beginning, I had like really some people angry and aggressive. I mean, there was one time that there were, and especially were very young people. I think there were like students and postdocs like really attacking me until someone senior in the back got up and said, guys, I mean, you're discussing little things. This is one of the best ideas I've heard in so long. And then it turned out that he was like an editor of a very big journal, and I was like, oh gosh, thanks, no. But the referee reports, and so I was really like amazed on. I wasn't even coming up with a new theory. I was just using an established theory, and I did the rigor mathematical calculation. So of course, like when I started to give talks, people would start coming up to me and say, you didn't calculate this noise. This noise is going to kill it for sure. And I was like, oh gosh, that's right. Okay, then I would go back and team, we need to calculate 3-body recombination because this experimentalist told me that's the killer. Okay, so then we find it, and yeah, okay, we lose some degrees of with some sensitivity, but then you come up with an idea on how could you increase the sensitivity by another thing. It's that's how they actually built LIGO at the beginning. They had loads of sources of noise that were terrible, and once the community started to work on it, they started step by step resolving all the issues until they managed to detect gravitational waves. But in this case, it was like me and my team, and we started to work out all these details, and the proposal started to become stronger and stronger because we had looked at more details. And then I would go and give a talk, and at some point I had answers to, and what about this? Well, we did a study, and this is the result of the study. But in spite of that, people would not look at it. And actually, that's how I met Roger Penrose, because I was giving a talk about it, and he found it interesting. And then he approached and he said, like, I want to know more about it, and we started to talk. But now I went the other day to a conference, and I see a poster, and I see like squeezing this, that, all the ingredients, like almost what I had proposed, with no like acknowledgement to my work, no. So I think it was not with bad intention, but I went and I said, look, I want to give you these papers that I wrote like now 10 years ago, right, with this idea. So now people start making similar ideas to mine without even being aware of the work I did, and some maybe they have, but I think this is starting to become a thing. But like I worked on it, and then at some point I pushed really hard on it, and now I'm very excited about the new stuff I'm doing, and I think eventually somebody's going to take it with a fresh mind. Maybe someone young is going to say, hey, if I do this, would be super cool, because you can use it to search for dark energy, for search for dark matter, to test different gravitational stuff. You can use it to test and searches for different sort of modifications of gravity. And I also used it to measure the local gravitational field, and I patented it. So that I was because I had to really fight also the officers with the patent, but it's now patented in the US and in Europe. And I think eventually someone is going to come up and take on it and use it. I'm not too worried, but it was an interesting experience.
That's really cool. Do you think it's gonna do you think that when these experiments are finally run that they'll contradict the LIGO experiments, or will they confirm the LIGO experiments? Is it a different prediction set,
It's
or
That's a really good question, and thanks for making it, because I didn't say that. So LIGO works in a frequency window, but at high frequencies it loses sensitivity. And interestingly, this one works in the high frequency scales where LIGO doesn't work so well. So for events that LIGO detects, the LIGO interferometer is much better. But at high frequencies, people working in astrophysics, I had to learn all of this, make predictions of some more like exotic sources of high frequency gravitational waves. So these could be like primordial black holes or dark matter and things like that. And this detector concept, let's say, would be ideal for those high frequency. It's more like long lived also gravitational waves, because the mergers are very short lived, and the detector concept we propose doesn't work for very short-lived events. They need to be more like a persistent source of gravitational waves. So for example, pulsars that have like a modification, like a bump or something like that, are predicted to make a continuous source of high frequency gravitational waves, and it could work for that as well.
Very cool. Gosh, we didn't even get to we're running out of time, and we didn't get a chance to talk about the paper that killed Christmas. And
Yes,
yeah, I
yes,
mean,
yes,
we'll
yes.
have to circle back around once you actually publish this thing. But is there
Yes.
anything you can tease people with this work, this massive work that you have been building towards in the last few
Yes.
years?
Well, first I have to make sure it doesn't kill the next Christmas. It's like I want to get it out before Christmas. And well, it started because like I said, I thought of Roger's idea and Dios's idea that gravity collapses the wave function is a good one. I thought it's like a logical and a good let's say proposal. But Roger only gave a time scale at which this was going to work, based on like an energy um, time uncertainty principle, based on an energy that is some gravitational origin, like the self gravity of the superposition. And Diosi had arrived to exactly the same expression, but Diosi took it further, and he actually made a model, which is a stochastic model. So it sort of predicts that suddenly, due to gravity, the superposition is going to collapse. But because it's sudden and it's a stochastic, it predicts like spurious radiation. It doesn't conserve energy, which is, I don't know, from me, this would be something as a theoretician I wouldn't like. And also Roger finds that as a problem. Um, but because it doesn't conserve energy, if you had like a big mass that can be in a super small superposition, or not even, the mass would radiate. And they did experiments to test this. And not only there's proposals for collapse that are not based on gravity, but there are many collapse models based on Brownian motion or other fields that we don't know what they are. There's many models. So these would be, kind of trying to test different models, but they didn't see the radiation up to quite constraining parameters. So up to those let's say masses and so on that they did in the experiment, they did not observe the stochastic collapse of the wave function. So in the newspaper, it was like everywhere. They said things like Angelo Bassi, who was one of my colleagues, he's a theoretician, proved Nobel Prize winner Roger Penrose wrong. So Roger was obviously not very happy about it. And he was, he was like a little angry, and he would say, well, it's not even my model, because I've never said it's stochastic. This is like Diosi's model, and I don't like it because it doesn't conserve energy, and I don't like it because of that. And then it came to the idea that, oh, well, maybe I can try to do something. different. So I wasn't like, I was still pushing on my Bose-Einstein condensate gravitational wave detector. And Roger was always talking about the collapse, and I wrote a paper with him, but I really didn't want to go in that direction because I wanted to keep pushing in, let's say, what I saw as mine. But when I saw that he was upset, I think that sort of moved me. He's a very sweet person. He's very, very nice. And I just thought, well, maybe I can give it a go. And that's been like now almost 3 years of trying to build a model that is energy conserving. So, and I think that was something that people were trying to do, an energy conserving model. But I think I was just very lucky to see things in the right way. So that is one of the things that it resolves, but it resolves other more exciting problems at the same time that we just came up with by luck. And so, yeah.
All right, we're gonna. I
I-
really hope we can get you back after this paper comes out, and we'll try to. 'Cause I
Oh,
got a million
yeah.
questions about everything you just said, but I feel like it'd be better to save that for
Yes.
next time.
Yes, and I'm going to be talking about how do I see mass in the quantum reality,
Mm,
and how like mass in the classical world then makes sense and so on. So
all
I
right.
think it's gonna be a lot of fun, and I probably also will get, and I'm hoping to get an interesting reaction from the scientific community. But I would love to have the chance to come and talk to you about it here. That would be great.
That'd be fantastic.
Next time, what is mass? That sounds like a fun discussion.
I
That sounds like a normal Tuesday here at our house, but
hopefully it'll be less
Yeah.
contentious than it usually is when we discuss these things.
Well, I don't think it gives you like the ultimate answer, because you get a level of explanation that maybe is kind of better, but within that level of explanation, there's still going to be, like, and what is this? And like, oh gosh, okay, yes, but
yeah, it's never
but
over.
yeah. But I mean, I think the issue of the energy conservation is like, and it's a new model that will enable to say, no, this collapse of the wave function due to gravity is not ruled out. There's still hope for it. And we're proposing an experiment, and there I have the money to do the experiment.
Ooh.
Nice.
A very generous donor gave us the money to test that new model. So
That's
you
really
see, like,
fantastic.
science is funny, because I was pushing for the other thing for a really long time, and I didn't have it hasn't been tested. Nobody's trying to test it at the moment, as far as I know. But the other thing, I'm not finished yet, and I already have the money to test it. So life is funny, but I just go with the flow.
I love
I
it.
love that. Yeah. I mean, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really love how you think about these things, and just the joy and enthusiasm that you bring to it, and the philosophy and the willingness to explore. It's really wonderful. I appreciate you spending all this time
Oh,
with us.
thank you. Thank you very much. No, I love talking to you. I just felt like it was all flowing, like the conversation very well, and that we have similar interests and curiosities and so on. So I just felt like very at home, and I want to do more of it for sure.
Fantastic. We look forward to it when the paper's published. So let's do it again.
I'll let you know. Yes,
Okay.
for sure.
Fantastic.
It's also
All right.
it's a really good opportunity for me to explain things also to a different audience about how things work and so on. So that be a really good opportunity for me.
Absolutely. And we'll be thinking hard about mass in the meantime.
Okay, wonderful.
All right, Yvette. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah. Have a great rest of
Thank
your
you
night.
very much.
Bye,
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye bye.